faithfully delivering value and interpreting great books worldwide. Hello, this is Sally's Book Talk. Today, I'm bringing you a little history of human decapitation. This is the work of British anthropologist Frances Larson. Larson is the curator of the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, UK. As a female scholar, why did she develop such a strong interest in decapitation? This has to do with her work environment. The Pitt Rivers Museum at Oxford University is hailed as a paradise for those with eccentric tastes, housing over 300,000 items. Artifacts from around the world are bizarre, including 300 human skulls that people love to talk about. As an anthropologist and museum curator, Larson's work involves being among rows of skull display cabinets, studying how to store, view, and understand these heads. Over time, her interest gradually spread to the stories behind each skull. As an anthropology PhD, Larson is not interested in sensational stories. In her book, she explores the relationship between humans and heads from various angles, such as anthropology, psychology, natural history, medicine, and the art of war. However, this is not an academic work, nor is it a pure historical work. This book is more like a collection of fun stories about heads, where the author satisfies people's curiosity about decapitation in a popular and slightly humorous tone, answering questions with professional knowledge. Although the book is titled A Little History of Human Decapitation, accurately speaking, the author discusses not only the history of decapitation, but also how Westerners have paid attention to and explored heads. To make it easier to understand the book's content, I've divided the stories into 4 themes. First, human attention and worship of heads. Second, the different roles heads have played on the historical stage. Third, the image of heads in artworks. Fourth, scientific research related to heads. But before formally delving into the book's content, I feel it necessary to remind you, if you're timid, please don't listen to this before bedtime. All right, back to the topic. Let's first look at the first aspect: human attention and worship of heads. To explore human attention to heads, we must understand a basic premise. Heads have an exceptionally strong spiritual, symbolic meaning for humans. The biggest difference between the head and other body parts is that it holds the human brain and facial expressions, determines thought expression, emotions are most vivid. When people face a head, they inevitably associate it with human expressions and appearances. Human attention to heads is essentially attention to their own emotions and to the emotional exchange between people. Historically, human attention to heads has also triggered another extreme emotion: the worship of living life. Why would anyone worship a departed shell? In the past, when faced with unsolvable problems or confusion, people often sought help from the dead. The dead or their ghosts were believed to have magical powers, and the head was the carrier of that magic. Larson points out that the head is the least perishable part of the skeleton, seeming to possess a magical power to resist death. Therefore, behind the worship of heads lies humanity's longing for eternal life. For example, the heads and relics of Christian saints are often seen as objects of worship. They're preserved in exquisitely crafted reliquaries adorned with gems and gold, displayed on magnificent altars for believers to worship and imagine. Beyond saint worship, European history had a superstition that the skull and blood of beheaded people could cure diseases like epilepsy. Just as in Lucian's writing about human blood-steamed buns, seeking help from the dead is a human instinct. Despite huge differences in cultural backgrounds between East and West, people's worship psychology is surprisingly similar. Another type of head people worship is that of geniuses. Beethoven, Mozart, and Schubert's heads became collectibles for their admirers. The head, as a materialized image, preserves the wisdom and talent its owner once possessed. Admirers try to continue that wisdom by collecting these heads. Here, the head symbolizes the brain, and collecting and worshiping heads seems to blend spiritual and scientific foundations. Larson also discusses how human attention to heads varies greatly across different historical periods and cultural domains. Next, we enter the second aspect he focuses on: the different roles heads have played on the historical stage. In this section, Larson unfolds along two threads: Western decapitation punishments and guillotine culture, and the relationship between soldiers and the remains of the dead during wars. First, let's look at Western decapitation punishments. Before the invention of the guillotine, decapitation existed as a form of capital punishment in Europe for millennia. For Europeans, this was a relatively civilized method. It's said that in Britain, only nobles and wealthy people had the privilege of this punishment. Compared to hanging, beheading was faster, caused less suffering for the prisoner, and thus seemed more dignified. But the technical problems of decapitation weren't perfectly solved for a long time. Historical records show that handheld axes or swords were relatively inefficient for beheading. During the French Revolution in the late 18th century, the guillotine finally changed the situation. The blade-style guillotine was convenient and efficient, solving the technical issues of decapitation while minimizing cruelty. The guillotine greatly improved the efficiency of beheading. According to statistics during the Jacobin dictatorship in 1793, tens of thousands were executed. Without the guillotine, such a large number of executions couldn't have been carried out in such a short time. The guillotine's emergence in the late 18th century was a prelude to mass industrial production and foreshadowed the coming industrial revolution. From another perspective, compared to traditional execution scenes, while the guillotine improved efficiency, it significantly reduced the drama of capital punishment. Spectators who gathered at decapitation sites felt excitement, fear, even guilt, anticipating horrifying violence. But the guillotine shortened the performance, diluted the sense of evil, and greatly reduced spectator satisfaction. Thus, beheading was no longer a spectacular show, and even death became mundane. But an undeniable reality is that humanity's inner craving for bloodshed doesn't disappear. In recent years, terrorist beheading videos have resurfaced online, bringing decapitation scenes back to public view after 2 centuries. Because the internet's reach is wider than traditional channels, and its anonymity reduces moral constraints, these beheading performances attracted an unprecedented audience that, in creating fear and panic, these videos are far less potent than historical live spectacles. Next, let's examine soldiers' relationship with the dead during wars. Larson notes a peculiar phenomenon. During 284 in the Pacific, Allied soldiers would decapitate Japanese soldiers and collect their heads as trophies. Why would these highly civilized Western individuals break free from moral constraints in specific scenarios? He explains the logic behind this cruel phenomenon. Objectively, the harsh environment and brutal combat in the Pacific theater imposed immense psychological pressure on Allied soldiers. To relieve stress and pass tedious time, the bones of the dead became entertainment objects for many soldiers. They would process bones into ornaments and clean enemy heads to keep as souvenirs. This behavior released stress and was an instinctive reaction humans develop in extreme situations. Subjectively, during the Pacific War, Japanese troops persistently resisted and refused to surrender, greatly suppressing Allied combat effectiveness. To incite hatred and boost morale, Allied officials portrayed the Japanese as demonic, non-human figures, making soldiers view them as monsters rather than fellow humans. Therefore, when facing Japanese heads, they were less morally constrained and more likely to overturn traditional ethical rules. In their view, head collecting represented the power and pride of defeating the enemy. Intriguingly, even modern soldiers, choosing enemy heads as trophies, can't escape strong racial psychology. During 19th century colonial wars, British and German soldiers collected many heads of local black people in Africa, yet almost never took white heads, even from enemies. Research by American forensic experts and scientists further confirmed deep-seated racial taboos among white soldiers. Statistics show all skull and bone trophies brought back by white soldiers during Will came from the Japanese. After discussing historical heads, Larson moves to the third aspect, artistic representations of heads. Compared to direct shock, artistic depictions allow viewers to safely gain aesthetic pleasure while remaining detached. 17th century Italian painter Caravaggio excelled at capturing life's departure. His beheading of St. John is a decapitation masterpiece. In the painting, John the Baptist is pale, his neck seemingly incompletely severed, blood spurting out, with the artist's signature in the bloodstain. On the other side, Salome's maid bends down with a silver platter, approaching John's soon-to-fall head. In this painting, Caravaggio depicts the decapitation scene as imagined by countless people. He precisely captures the agonizing moment John is suspended between life and death. He presents this cruelty to the audience, seemingly intending to explore the boundary between life and death through the image. In the painting, this boundary remains open, and it's unclear whether Caravaggio himself was an enthusiast of violence and passion. Images of human heads appear repeatedly in his works. In single quotation mark, David with the head of Goliath. He even substituted Goliath's head with his own likeness. Soon after completing this work, Caravaggio died in a duel with a romantic rival at 37. If Caravaggio was obsessed with blood-soaked dark scenes, Renaissance sculptor Donatello preferred depicting the panic when heads suddenly appear in public. In his famous Feast of Herod, John the Baptist's head is brought before King Herod on a platter. Herod recoils in horror, raising his hands in instinctive resistance, shrinking into the painting's corner, nearly pushed out of the frame. Meanwhile, banquet guests on the other side cover their faces and flee in terror. Interestingly, Donatello used advanced perspective techniques, arranging 3 spatial planes vertically with the terrified crowd in foreground. In the 2 background planes, people remain unaware of the head, still immersed in the banquet's peaceful atmosphere. The stark emotional contrast within one frame heightens the horror to a climax. In 1818, 19th century French painter Theodore Géricault created severed heads. Among artworks on this theme, it remains the most unforgettable. On a blood-stained cloth, a head gapes open-mouthed, with wide eyes, seemingly frozen in fear and despair after witnessing its own death. Géricault, known for rationalism, frequently dissected corpses and sketched them. This work's hyper-realism, combined with the artist's detached objectivity, creates chilling authenticity and terror. Western painters are obsessed with capturing expressions at life's departure. During the French Revolution, Madame Tussaud took Robespierre's freshly severed head to make a facial mold. While revolutionary Marat spilled blood in his bathtub, Madame Tussaud suppressed her grief to replicate his face. This launched Madame Tussaud's wax museums now worldwide, generating substantial profits. Art's fascination with fresh heads exploits humanity's endless curiosity about the life-death boundary. A fresh head seems to cling to life, holding more genuine shock and imagination than a dried skull. If science can't restore life to severed heads, art perfectly compensates for this human regret. By depicting heads on life's edge, art reanimates them. Finally, let's follow Larson to examine, fourth, scientific research on heads. Early pseudoscience phrenology swept 19th century Europe. Its core premise was that personality could be read through skull study. Phrenologists collected skull samples, analyzing shapes to map traits onto head regions. For example, the area controlling amativeness, rational thinking at the skull's base, aggression and greed at the forehead. Phrenology was essentially business masquerading as science. Renowned phrenologists attracted steady clients, earning well from the pseudoscience. Scottish phrenologist George Combs' The Constitution of Man sold 100,000 copies by 1860, while Darwin's Origin of Species sold 50,000 by century's end. By late 19th century, phrenology declined but established Europe's head-collecting tradition, aiding later anthropology and medical research. Today, a significant portion of skulls preserved in Western museums originate from the peak era of phrenology. The prevalence of phrenology represented a detour in Western scientific research. By the 20th century, scientists reached consensus that the brain dominates human thought. Scientists shifted focus from skulls to brains as the primary object of studying human cognition, making brains the new scientific focal point. Brains preserved in jars provided research data through measurement and comparative analysis. Brains gradually replaced skulls as the materialized representation of human thought. This image of brains in jars later became a recurring motif in science fiction novels and films. And Lawson also addresses another research-related issue, one many avoid, yet can't conceal curiosity about. For medical students, dissecting human heads first requires overcoming emotional torment. Compared to other body parts, the head more distinctly represents personal identity. Its stark realism and intense humanity trigger continuous associations in dissectors. Thus, medical schools schedule head dissections after body dissections for student adaptation. In practice, dissection demands intense concentration and precision, temporarily overshadowing emotional distress. Especially with heads' complex structure requiring exact control of force, angle, and position. Ordinary people often perceive doctors as purely rational dissection machines. To complete this violent work, they must temporarily suspend their humanity. However, Larson reveals this isn't true. Professional dissection fosters profound respect and tenderness toward the subject. Movements soften, violence and gentleness intertwine. Quiet moments emerge as doctors memorialize them. Under the scalpel was once a vibrant and beautiful life. For Chinese readers, Larson's detailed descriptions of dissecting heads might be unsettling. This isn't because his descriptions are overly cruel. On the contrary, when discussing relatively violent and bloody scenes, his writing is restrained and rational, occasionally with subtle humor. Compared to the exaggerated narratives of torture in traditional Chinese literature, its cruelty is like small fry next to a big fish. And what truly makes Chinese readers uncomfortable is his obsessive attitude towards precise details. Behind this attitude lies a rational perspective shaped by empiricism and scientific thinking in Western culture. Meanwhile, Chinese readers more enjoy the romantic depictions of brutal scenes in literature, whether in martial arts novels or historical texts. In the final chapter of his book, Larson explores historical scientific experiments involving human heads, a quest to understand life and death. Human scientific experiments on heads have never ceased. All along, attention has focused on one question: how long can humans survive after separation from the body? During the French Revolution, curious onlookers waited under the guillotine to catch freshly severed heads, trying to determine how long consciousness lasts. Later, more radical researchers tried various ways to revive severed heads, even connecting human carotid arteries to live dogs. These attempts didn't yield convincing scientific results, but sparked a series of profound scientific and philosophical questions. Now, what is death? How does it happen? And what is the definition of life? Today, the medical community largely agrees that brain death is the criterion for clinical death. But what is the process of brain death like? How long does the entire process last? These remain a series of mysteries. In the late 20th century, with the widespread success of organ transplants, head transplantation became a daring experiment for scientists. Although there have been successful cases of head transplants in animals, when attempting to transplant human heads, or more accurately, transplant human bodies, it faces major ethical and legal issues. Another experiment related to human body transplantation is cryonics, which first appeared in science fiction. With scientific advancements, cryonics commercial institutions have emerged today. Cryonics experts believe that if the human body can be cooled rapidly and preserved professionally, future technology can fully repair the brain and body. When patients wake up in the future, they'll find themselves young and healthy again. But since preserving entire bodies costs far more than just heads, most cryopreserved humans are actually just heads. Scientists even coined a less terrifying term for this: cephalic isolation. This raises another question. Does personality reside solely in our brains? So far, modern science can't prove personality exists entirely in the head. Head transplants aren't as simple as donating a body. Some heart transplant patients unexpectedly developed personality traits of their donors. Perhaps visceral nerves don't affect thinking, but influence emotions, blurring the line between body and mind. Future consumers must weigh full body versus head-only cryopreservation. Getting objective analysis of head-related books is hard. The topic's intimacy clouds our perspective. Yet books temper our unease, like museum glass separating us from displayed skulls, maintaining distance from horror. In the book's conclusion, Larson analyzes the complex emotions a little history of human decapitation may evoke. Facing a severed head triggers sudden, unsettling feelings that leave humans disoriented. Thus, most people discuss heads with humor or self-mockery. Yet, this head-focused work always stirs hidden emotions and thoughts within us. Its complex, contradictory themes captivate our attention. Familiar yet alien, these topics spark both curiosity and instinctive resistance, constantly excavating self-knowledge and forcing inner confrontation. Maybe we don't love every part of this book, but you know what? It's tough to put it down. This could be the most important thing that makes Larson's work stand out from others. All right, that wraps up our take on A Little History of Human Decapitation. The keynotes are below the audio. Catch you tomorrow.